Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Congressman Hurd, I really want to thank you for your leadership on this issue, and to the gentleman from New Jersey as well, Mr. Payne and Mr. Thompson. We want to thank you as well for helping us out on that, and to Mr. DeFazio, too, and certainly to Chairman Michael McCall. Look, this answer by the TSA makes no sense from a security standpoint and hurts our smaller communities that may go from time to time without air service, but clamor for air service. You know, if you're a big airport and you lose a carrier, you probably have several others there serving the people of that area. If you're a small airport and you have one carrier, as is the case in Klamath Falls, Oregon, in June of 2014 when SkyWest pulled out, they had no other carrier, so they immediately began to seek additional air service, and the city of Klamath Falls acted diligently. They recruited a new partner, Peninsula Airways, in July of 2015. So like a year later, they had somebody in line, and everything was working out, and they go to TSA, and TSA says, no, we're not coming back. And their answer was to reverse screen. And I said, well, what's that? Well, that means you board the 28 or 30 passenger airplane with all your luggage, everything else, and then you fly, in this case, 236 miles north to Portland, Oregon, Oregon's largest city. Then you deplane on the tarmac, and you come back through like you'd just driven up. Well, that's an interesting way to provide security for the nation's communities and airplanes, because that means you've flown right up the entire length of Oregon from the California border down here in Klamath Falls all the way to Portland. Now, let me put that in an East Coast perspective for you. That would be like boarding planes in Raleigh-Durham International Airport down in North Carolina, in Raleigh, and then you would fly all the way up to Reagan-Washington National Airport, up to DCA here. Actually, we go 4 miles further in Oregon, but we'll leave that aside for the moment, 232 miles versus 236. And then you get off the airplane here at Reagan National, and then we'll screen you. We'll find out what you're carrying, what's in your bags, and then we'll put you on the connecting flight. Does anybody think that's a good security thing? Does anybody think the people who want to do us harm aren't going to figure that gaping hole out? So Portland International Airport was willing to work with us, but it made no sense. So we pleaded with TSA, can't you come back? You were here before. It won't take much. And they basically said no. And that's what brings us here today. For our nation's security, for our economic security of our small communities, we need to pass this bipartisan legislation. And on a side note, the nation's only F-15 training unit is in Klamath Falls at Kingsley Airfield. So our F-15 pilots have to come out now, and rather than fly into Klamath Falls, they have to fly into an airport that's at least, on a bad day, probably 2 hours over the mountains, and then come over. So we're paying all that extra transportation costs, we're paying hotels, everything else, delaying their access to training, and that doesn't make sense either. So let's be safe and secure, let's be smart and prudent, let's pass this legislation and allow our communities to have the air service they need and our country to have the security that we demand. So this is common sense legislation that we need to pass. I thank both sides of the aisle for your great work on this with us, and together we're going to do the right policy even when TSA wouldn't. So I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Texas is recognized. Back. Gentleman reserves.